Hello, everybody. I'm a practicing therapist and I'm also a doctoral student of psychology. Today, we are going to go over the differences between fearful avoidant attachment. So, this is also called disorganized attachment and dismissive avoidant attachment styles, okay? And this is going to be based on my experience as a therapist and things that I have seen. This video, basically, I'm aiming to educate individuals on these differences so that we can improve relationships and the understanding of the relationship, okay? And I think it's very important to recognize that the very first difference is actually the criteria of these two individuals. Fearful avoidant individuals tend to have very volatile childhood experiences. They score very high on the adverse childhood experiences scale, whereas dismissive avoidant individuals, they don't have trauma that is necessarily obvious. A lot of times, if you ask a dismissive avoidant, have you been traumatized? Have you been abused? They will probably say no, even though there is a lot of emotional neglect. They just are not aware of it. Whereas most fearful avoidant individuals are actually aware that their childhood was pretty traumatic. Now, dismissive avoidant individuals tend to be met with a lot of dismissive parenting. Their parent might say, don't show any emotions. It's not good. It makes you weak. Don't be like that. You're my oldest child. You're my youngest child. You're my favorite child. Whatever it is, they start showing that being unemotional and being detached and being independent is the way to receive their parents' love. And so they were taught to do that subconsciously. Whereas fearful avoidant individuals, interesting enough, they were taught both dynamics. So where a person is anxious, which is one part of the fearful avoidant, your parent may be very dismissive towards you, similar to avoidant individuals. However, you being unemotional and detached does not get the parent's love. In fact, you having an emotional tantrum, not a negative way, a child, right? You're a child. It's actually a clinical term. We call it tantruming. The child is expressing themselves overly, and then finally the caregiver feeds the child the bottle, or finally the caregiver gives the child the toy they were trying to reach off the shelf, right? Whereas a parent of a dismissive avoidant, they don't model that. They will say, no, I'm not going to give it to you until you stop crying, right? So it's very different. Whereas the anxious parent will be like, okay, let me give you this just so you stop crying. And so the two were modeled the opposite, right? Dismissive avoidant, okay, I'm going to make you stop. Like, I'm going to give that to you. You're going to get dinner as long as you stop crying. So why does that have to do with fearful avoidant individuals? Fearful avoidant individuals have a very unfortunate situation. All of insecure individuals do. But with fearful avoidance, they had to do what was best for that certain situation. That's why they tend to score the highest on the adverse childhood experiences scale, because one day their caregiver will be more, okay, I'll give you the food if you stop crying. Like, whatever makes you stop crying, here's the food. So now they were taught, okay, this very second, I have to be emotional to get my needs. The next day is, you better stop crying, otherwise I'm not going to give you anything, right? Now their needs are, okay, I'm going to shut my emotions off to get my needs met. So they have to transfer between emotionally expressive or emotionally detached, depending on their caregiver's fluctuating mood, right? The other two, it's not as inconsistent. Anxious individuals may have a more inconsistent childhood to where maybe a parent is away, maybe a parent is not home. However, in general, the anxious individual was taught and learned that if I reach out and express my needs, that's the only way I'll get my needs met. Dismissive avoidant, the only way they get their needs met is if they keep their emotions to themselves. Fearful avoidant, they're always guessing and checking everything. At a drop of a hat, something changes. And so that's why they have both sides. Unfortunately, they had to learn both coping strategies, and it can be very challenging. So that is the main difference between fearful avoidant and dismissive avoidant, their childhood. That's actually the only way you can really tell. And that's the best way to tell, the only surefire way, that difference, okay? But what about their self-perception, how they perceive themselves? Dismissive avoidants tend to not have a too shaken self-worth. However, this tends to be a coping mechanism. They do tend to see themselves as flawed. They might see themselves as different, but they don't necessarily use that as an incentive to change. They don't think, okay, because I'm different, I should change, or I should not like myself, or I'm not a good person. They actually turn it around. I'm different, but that's a good thing. Or I'm proud that I'm not like other people. Or I don't want to be like anybody else. I'm independent. I'm strong, right? Because they were taught in childhood, hey, as long as you're strong, you get your way. As long as you're strong, you're a good person. As long as you're strong, you're acceptable. So that's why they perceive themselves that way. Whereas fearful avoidance, They tend to be, because of the burden of the trauma, they tend to view themselves as somebody that is flawed, but very much they externalize it and internalize it. So they start seeing, they're okay with saying it. Hey, I know I'm flawed, or maybe you don't like me, or maybe you are going to leave me, or maybe you are going to cheat on me. And they're very defeated about relationships. Where avoidant individuals, they are defeated, but more so in a way where, okay, I guess I don't need relationships, me, myself, and I. Whereas fearful avoidants are like, I don't really trust myself. I don't really have much. And I wish I could have a relationship, but I probably can't. And so I'm just going to give up. I don't really know what to do. I wish I could be loved, but at the same time, it seems very overwhelming. And so very conflicting traits. They tend to have a lower self-perception, self-worth, okay? The next one is their perception of vulnerability. Dismissive avoidant individuals often struggle with vulnerability. They have very little practice with vulnerability because remember, in their childhood, they were basically taught not to show that emotion. So how they deal with emotions, they tend to self-soothe through detachment or hobbies. Whereas fearful avoidants, they exhibit both anxious and avoidant traits. So they do struggle with vulnerability and they struggle with opening up, but they can open up, but typically what happens is when they open up, they shut down very quickly. They may self-soothe with detaching, but it might not be in the sense of hobbies. It might be pulling away or shutting themselves in their room. It might even be crying to themselves. It might even be just laying in the dark, because you have to remember these people are also burdened with a lot of other experiences. A lot of these individuals, fearful avoidance, a lot of them have PTSD, complex PTSD, other types of trauma. And so they are struggling with both those things, or many of those things, while they're struggling with vulnerability. They may have narratives that vulnerability is harmful. They may have narratives that if you're vulnerable, someone's going to manipulate that and use it against you. And while dismissive avoidants have that as well, their main narrative is, as long as you don't show your vulnerability and you're strong, you're going to be okay. Whereas fearful avoidants, they don't really know what makes them okay. They just want to always be hypervigilant and protect themselves. So they have a different relationship with vulnerability, each of the avoidants there, okay? The next one is the relationship preferences, okay? Dismissive avoidants, they tend to have short-term connections for a lot of their life. However, they tend to commit very slowly, to which they stick to that one person for a very long time. So basically the best way to put it is when they're not feeling safe, it's going to be a lot of short-term connections or no connections at all. However, if they have that long-term connection, they stay with just that person, and it's usually very, very, very slowly committing, okay? So one or the other. Whereas fearful avoidance, they may have a lot of short-term relationships, they may have long-term relationships, a lot of off and on type of relationships, and it may lead to a very hot and cold dynamic. They have relationships, but they also fear the demands of the relationship. And so they're very concerned and confused about what a relationship looks like. Sadly, a lot of them may not have a good model for what relationships look like. Dismissive avoidance may not as well, but they tend to not view relationships as entirely volatile comparison to fearful avoidance. They may be very afraid of relationships. They don't know what it looks like. If it's feeling very secure, they might feel afraid of it. If it's feeling too anxious, they may feel suffocated. If it's feeling too distant, they may feel anxious. And so they're always bouncing around different perspectives, and they're really trying to fight these fears while still having and maintaining a relationship. So you might see these dynamics show up, okay? The next one is their perspective of boundaries, okay? Or I guess not boundaries, but fear of compromise, or the way they compromise. Dismissive avoidants tend to have very minimal awareness of their personal needs. And so what ends up happening is they may keep relationships very private. They may perceive relationships to be something that needs to be very cautious and slow towards. So they may have a lot of preferences. They may have a long list of what they want in a person, and they may test their partner a lot to make sure, is this person right for me or is it not? Because I'm not going to waste my time if it's not worth it, because I don't really like relationships all that much. And so I'm only going to commit if it's really worth it. So they're very slow to that commitment. They're very rigid. They don't want to see you at certain times. They're really uncomfortable with you infringing on their space. You'll see that a lot with dismissive avoidance. Fearful avoidance, they can be very rigid when it comes to scheduling, but they struggle with asserting those boundaries. So they may not want to see you at a certain time, but they might not tell you. So they might cancel on you more. They might ghost you because they're They don't want to see you at this time, but they're not really telling you. They might be uncomfortable with their boundaries being crossed. Maybe their partner is being too much, or maybe their partner is not giving them enough and they're just stuck in the middle. They're not really saying anything. And this is when sometimes they might bottle up and crash out and feel very emotional and might say some things that they don't mean. And so because the fearful avoidant is struggling between communicating and knowing their own needs, they tend to remain in unsatisfying relationships for a lot longer than dismissive avoidants do. The next one is their coping strategies and mechanisms. Dismissive avoidants tend to engage in external activities for self-regulation, and sometimes that may also mean that they are very distant in their relationship because they have to do all of these activities. So I've talked about depression with avoidance. A lot of them might gamble, might drink. A lot of them might do more healthy activities, jogging, running, reading books, playing a musical instrument, having a garden, but they have all these activities, so they have a little bit less time with relationships. Fearful avoidants, what they do when they're trying to regulate is they tend to isolate, engage in mundane activities without a lot of self-soothing hobbies. So this may be like scrolling on Instagram. It might be sitting in front of the TV. It might be, I don't know, talking to ChatGPT. I think anxious individuals do that too, talking to ChatGPT. I'm not sure. But I do see this with both of them, where it's kind of like you're very anxious about something, but you don't really want to cope through it. You just want to process it in a more low stakes way, which is fine. But often what happens is fearful avoidants may also maintain contact with past relationships that they might not even want to commit to, but they may just maintain that relationship because they're afraid to hurt that person, or they use it for that small validation. And they're really struggling to cope. A lot of fearful avoidants struggle with coping mechanisms in general because, again, they had to change their coping style depending on their caregiver. So they don't really know what exactly to do or what to say. And the very last one is their emotional responses. Dismissive avoidants tend to lack sensitivity. And what ends up happening is if they're hurt about something, they tend to cut the tie off almost immediately. And they may feel very uncomfortable with disagreements. They may feel like they need to take more time to self-regulate depending on a lot of these emotional responses, whereas fearful avoidants tend to be very highly sensitive to these things, and they may be very anxious after disagreements, and they may be feeling more afraid of being betrayed. But what ends up happening is they're having these emotional responses, but they feel uncomfortable with their own anxious tendencies. And so their detachment is based on their own anxious tendencies because they're trying to pull away from the fears that they're having. And so you see that black and white, off and on type of feeling. Whereas dismissive avoidance, when you hurt them or when they're struggling to understand something, they need that space to process it. Whereas fearful avoidance, they might want to talk it out, but then they feel uncomfortable, so they pull away. They might change their mind many times, and you're starting to see that. So those are some of the many differences between fearful avoidant and dismissive avoidance. I hope this video was helpful. Please like, subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.